Before we dive in, if you love powerful stories where truth always finds a way, hit subscribe to Story Tier and turn on the bell. Now, let's begin the art room. Hadn't seen change in years. The cracked windows let in more dust than sunlight, and the faded smell of turpentine clung to the walls like a ghost that refused to leave. Wooden stools stood uneven on the scarred floor, each carrying the quiet burden of restless students over the years. The same tattered posters of Picasso and Van Gogh hung crookedly, the corners curled like dried leaves. This room, with its peeling corners and forgotten dreams, waited silently for something new and, one afternoon, it arrived. She stepped in without fanfare, just a soft push of the heavy door, and a moment of stillness as she surveyed the room. Graceful in movement and grounded in presence, she walked with the kind of calm that didn't beg attention but somehow demanded it. Her skin glowed like warm bronze, her hair coiled neatly into a crown of pride, and her eyes, they carried stories that could silence storms. Students turned their heads, some with genuine curiosity, others with quick glances followed by muttered chuckles. She ignored it all. She moved with quiet purpose, setting her satchel down gently on the paint-stained desk at the front. From it, she began unpacking her supplies, notebooks wrapped in canvas, brushes neatly tied with twine, a collection of charcoal pencils, pastels, and clay still cold from the morning. Without speaking a word, she pinned a blank canvas to the easel, stood back, and simply looked at it. Her breathing was even, her posture steady. She didn't introduce herself right away. She didn't ask for their attention. She merely began, preparing as if the room already belonged to her, but come especially in a woman who looks like hers, often misread as weakness. By the time the bell rang and the students shuffled in, their sneakers squeaking and their laughter rising, the whispers had already begun. In the back row, someone muttered something under their breath. A few students exchanged knowing glances, elbowed each other. She turned and wrote on the board, her handwriting elegant, her movements precise. The first lesson wasn't about brush techniques or color theory. It was about finding your voice on paper. But before she could finish explaining, a boy yawned. Exaggeratedly, a girl clicked her pen repeatedly. Another smirked, clearly enjoying the slow unraveling of respect. Still, she didn't flinch. She offered no correction, no warning. She simply placed a blank sheet on each desk and returned to the front of the class. Her voice was calm, lower than expected, with a weight that made you lean in to hear. She told them to draw what silence looked like. Most of them scoffed. One loudly asked what that even meant. A few scribbled nonsense on the page. But a couple actually paused, hesitated, and began to sketch. She walked between the rows slowly, stopping at one desk to adjust a pencil grip, complimenting a shade choice at another. There was no anger in her gaze, just presence. But underneath her bracelet, something small blinked green. Hidden inside her decorative brooch, stylish but subtle, was a tiny body camera. It wasn't a trap. She hadn't come here expecting war, but life had taught her that sometimes proof is your only ally. So it recorded, quietly, unblinking, as the class mocked, as they tossed erasers when her back was turned, as they mimicked her voice behind cupped hands. The camera remembered. Day after day, the resistance grew. Projects were left half-finished or not at all. Brushes went missing. Someone spilled ink across her desk and said it was an accident. Another cut small slits into the pages of her private sketchbook, which she kept carefully tucked away. Still, she came every morning, early, prepared, dressed with elegance that some mistook for arrogance. She greeted them each by name. She commented on haircuts, asked about soccer tryouts, noticed limps and coughs others overlooked, but every kindness she extended was met with coldness or worse, cruelty wrapped in sarcasm. They didn't just disrespect her as a teacher, they disrespected her as a person. Some questioned her credentials, not directly, but through snide comments. Others whispered that she probably got the job through pity or politics. One student once raised their hand and asked why they needed to learn art at all, especially from someone who doesn't even look like a real artist. They added with a smirk. A few laughed. She didn't, but she didn't snap either. She nodded slowly, looked around the room, and said, "Then let the art speak louder than I can." Her voice didn't rise, her hands didn't tremble, but her camera blinked. One afternoon, she stayed after school to clean up. As she picked up scattered papers, she found a note crumpled beneath a chair. It wasn't addressed, but it was clear. It was about her. Words scribbled in angry ink, racist slurs, jokes about her appearance, mockery of her voice, her clothing, even her hair. She stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, she folded it once and placed it in her satchel. The next day, she came in wearing a scarlet blouse and golden earrings that shimmered when she turned her head. She pinned a fresh canvas on the wall, bigger than usual. Students walked in, paused, sensing something different. The room felt charged. She stood before them and said today's class would be a critique. Everyone would bring a piece they'd created this semester and explain it. Most hadn't completed anything worth showing. Some scrambled to make something up. But she encouraged. everyone to participate, while the students fumbled through explanations. Rolling their eyes and offering lazy critiques, she stepped away for a moment, and that's when it happened. One student snuck up to the front and grabbed her canvas, her personal work she had stored behind the easel. It was a piece full of history, pain, and pride, something sacred. Without warning, they tossed it across the room. It slid across the floor and crashed into a stool. Another laughed and kicked it, smearing the charcoal across the delicate lines. Someone else yanked the hem of her blouse. Buttons popped. Her body jerked forward. The room exploded in laughter. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stepped back, breath shallow, eyes glassy. And then, she raised her hand to her bracelet. A soft click. The speakers crackled first in the classroom, then across the entire school. It had connected. The camera, paired with the school's internal system, began to broadcast. And not her voice, theirs. Every insult, every mocking tone, every slur whispered behind her. The recordings played clearly through every speaker in every classroom, hallway, and office. The students in the art room froze, faces draining of color. Some looked around, horrified. Others rushed to unplug the speakers, but it was too late. The truth had taken flight. Teachers in other rooms paused mid-sentence. Students stared at one another. The hallway fell silent. And in the middle of it all, she stood tall. Torn blouse, charcoal on her shoes. But taller than ever before, unshaken, seen. At first, the disrespect came in fragments, scattered like loose threads that didn't seem worth picking, up until they began to tangle. A brush missing here. A palette returned filthy and crusted with dried paint. A sketchbook, once full of quiet progress, found sliced down the spine or with pages torn at the edges. It could have been written off as carelessness, typical student negligence. But patterns have a way of revealing intention. Each morning, as she walked into the art room with a composed expression and a quiet hello, the atmosphere met her with a subtle chill, not one that could be explained by weather, but by the eyes that refused to meet hers. The conversations that paused mid-sentence when she walked by. The laughter that started as soon as her back turned. Even when she stood at the front of the class, speaking softly but confidently about contrast and composition, about the art of letting emotion lead the brush. She could hear the sighs, the whispered jokes, the deliberate mispronunciations of her name that turned into running gags among the students. She never corrected them, not because she didn't care, but because she knew it wouldn't matter. She had dealt with this kind of resistance before, not always in classrooms, but in rooms filled with assumptions. In spaces where her voice had to compete with the weight of skin, gender, and silence. So she remained calm, always calm. Her stillness wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She moved like water, quiet, steady, never stagnant. But even water wears away stone, and she had no intention of vanishing. What they couldn't see beneath her composed exterior was the decision she had already made long before her first lesson, that she would protect her peace without begging. For it hidden inside the elegant brooch pinned near her collarbone, its golden petals, seeming nothing more than a statement of personal style, was a body camera. Small, discreet, silent. It was motion activated and linked directly to her phone through a private app. She hadn't brought it to trap anyone. She wasn't looking for a fight. But the world had taught her that too often, those who endure quietly are expected to do so without evidence. And she had grown tired of fighting invisible battles alone. She had bought the camera years ago, after an incident in a different school where her word had been brushed aside by administrators who believed louder voices over truthful ones. Since then, the camera had traveled with her, rarely used, never needed, until now. The first time it recorded was accidental. One afternoon, while she was speaking to a small group about color balance, a student casually and without a trace of hesitation called her by a nickname twisted from her actual name, a nickname that sounded like a joke, but carried the weight of insult. Laughter erupted. It wasn't the kind of laughter that welcomed. It excluded, mocked, declared her an outsider. She had smiled then, not because she enjoyed the moment, but because some moments required a mask. The camera recorded it all. Clear voices, clear tones, the hurt buried beneath the noise. From then on, it became her silent witness. It captured the student who walked in late every day and smirked while tossing his bag directly onto her lesson plans. It recorded the girls who drew caricatures of her on the back of their sketchbooks and passed them around during critiques. One day, someone squirted a line of paint across the floor near her desk. She nearly slipped. They laughed like it was harmless fun. The camera didn't laugh. It remembered. It was the moment her tote bag, placed neatly under the desk, was soaked in water, spilled accidentally from a bottle dropped by a student who stared her in the eye the entire time. The camera caught his smirk. It caught his whispered brag to the student beside him. It caught the lack of apology. Then came the stolen supplies. She brought them herself, professional grade, carefully stored. Yet day by day, the supplies began to vanish. Brushes she had used for years disappeared without a trace. A box of oil pastels was found crushed beneath a desk. Clay was molded into vulgar shapes and stuck to the underside of tables. It wasn't just mischief, it was deliberate sabotage disguised as adolescent rebellion. And through all of it, she remained unfazed on the surface. She continued her lessons. She gave feedback. She offered second chances. She even wrote notes of encouragement on half-finished projects, hoping something might break through the hostility. But every act of grace was met with sharper defiance. A group of boys started humming loudly whenever she gave instructions. At first, it seemed harmless. Then it became disruptive. When she asked them to stop, they mimicked her tone and clapped. Slowly, sarcastically, the next day, they came into class with matching t-shirts that read, "Best art teacher ever," their eyes daring her to react. She didn't, but the camera blinked. One afternoon, she found a post online, an anonymous account run by students, posting memes, mocking teachers. She saw her face, edited onto cartoon bodies. She saw captions mocking her clothing, her voice, her hair. Some comments beneath were cruel, others simply laughed. None defended her. She sat in her empty classroom that evening, staring at the screen, her shoulders slumped, just for a moment. Then she closed the tab, pulled out her journal, and wrote down everything she remembered. The body cam became more than evidence, it became her journal's twin. One caught the emotions, the other caught the facts. There were moments when she felt the weight of it pressing against her. Not the camera, the silence. The exhausting work of being both teacher and guardian of her own dignity. But each morning, she stood at the door, smiled at each student as they entered, and kept her tone steady. Not fake, just centered. The administration had noticed none of it. Walkthroughs were brief, evaluations checked boxes. They saw a quiet classroom, they saw neat rows. They didn't see the eye rolls, the subtle power plays, the way some students would accidentally knock over her coffee and offer no help in cleaning it. She didn't report it. Not yet. Not because she couldn't, but because she wasn't ready for them to hear her words without proof. She had learned long ago that some ears only listen when shown a mirror. One particular day stood out. A student, quiet, observant, often lost in her own world, came up at the end of class. She didn't say much, just stood there, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. Then she looked up and whispered, "They think you don't notice. But I do." I'm sorry. She didn't cry, neither did the teacher. But something passed between them, an understanding, fragile but real. A reminder that the room wasn't entirely lost. That night, the teacher sat at home, reviewing footage. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to remember. Not just the cruelty, but the small moments that proved she wasn't invisible. A glance, a nod, a silent ally. She didn't know when the right moment would come, but she knew it was coming. She was gathering truth, one cruel comment at a time. And when the moment arrived, she would not shout. She would not accuse. She would simply press a button and let their own voices tell the story. It had been her idea to host the open critique, a gentle nudge toward vulnerability, a space where creativity could be shared, where students could learn the value of both offering and receiving feedback with grace. She called it Brave Walls. A day when the front of the classroom would become a gallery and every voice had the chance to speak, not to tear down, but to lift. That morning, she wore her favorite deep green blouse, one she hadn't worn all semester. It brought her calm, reminded her of forests and silence, of stillness that doesn't surrender. She arrived early, arranging easels around the room, placing index cards near each piece so the artists could leave notes for one another. Even the lights were softer too, of the fluorescence purposefully dimmed to create warmth. As the students trickled in, she welcomed each with the same steady smile. Some looked genuinely interested, holding their portfolios with care. Others dragged their feet, eyes rolling at the effort. Still, she remained hopeful. She introduced the format. Each student would place a piece at the front, describe their inspiration, and open the floor to kind observations and constructive ideas. It wasn't graded, it was for growth. She reminded them that art required courage, that it wasn't about perfection, but honesty. The critique began smoothly. A few students mumbled shy descriptions of their work. Some gave feedback that surprised her, kind, attentive, real. A sketch of a city skyline sparked a conversation about loneliness. A charcoal portrait led to an unexpected story about a missing grandmother. For a while, something felt possible in the room. The undercurrent of tension seemed too thin, but change rarely comes without resistance. She had left one of her own canvases resting behind the main easel, partially hidden. It wasn't for display. She had painted it months ago, a personal piece that stitched together parts of her past. Images layered in muted tones, hands reaching, eyes closed. A bridge cracked but still standing. It wasn't just paint, it was memory. It was wound and healing in one frame. She had no intention of showing it. It was just there, quiet. While she leaned over to help a student adjust their frame, her back turned, just briefly. The energy shifted, a rustle, a movement too quick, too loud. She straightened and saw it unfold in seconds. A boy, face smug with the glee of an audience, darted forward, reached behind the easel, and pulled her canvas into the open. A few students gasped. One muttered, "Wait, don't," but it was too late. The boy held the painting high like a prize, then with a dramatic flourish, dropped it to the floor. The wooden frame cracked. A girl nearby snorted with laughter. Another boy clapped slowly, mockingly. Then someone kicked the canvas across the room. The acrylic smudged. The lines distorted. One voice said, "Looks better now." She stepped forward instinctively, arms raised as if to catch something that was already broken. That's when it happened. A hand reached out behind her. Shameless hand yanked the back of her blouse. The fabric pulled taut. She gasped. Buttons popped. One hit the floor with a metallic clink. Another flew across the room and rolled beneath a stool. Her body jolted. She stumbled slightly but caught herself. A beat passed, then laughter. Laughter, loud, guttural, cruel. It echoed off the walls like a swarm of flies, buzzing around something they had ruined. The students didn't even try to hide it. Some clapped. A few cheered. One sat back, arms crossed, satisfied. She stood still. Her chest rose and fell sharply. Her eyes, wide and gleaming, scanned the room, not in panic, but in disbelief. There was no apology. No shame. Just the casual cruelty of those who had decided she didn't deserve humanity. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the fabric of her blouse together, holding it at the chest. Her hair had fallen out of its pin. A lock curled across her forehead. Her breath, stuttered. And then something changed. No one noticed the shift at first. The students continued laughing, nudging each other, proud of their moment. She didn't shout, she didn't plead. Instead, with her free hand, she reached for the bracelet on her wrist. It looked like a piece of costume jewelry, gold, with tiny etched designs. She pressed a button, small, almost invisible, hidden beneath the clasp. Just a soft click. A second passed, then another dot, and suddenly, the speakers in the room cracked to life. At first, it was just static. Confused glances darted around the room. A boy reached for his phone, thinking it was some Bluetooth error. But then, a voice rang out. Not hers, theirs. The recording played, clear and undeniable. It began with laughter, familiar laughter, then a voice, saying, "Why is she even here?" Followed by another, "She probably painted that trash with." Her eyes closed. Then came the mimicry. "Yes, students, today we're learning how to be irrelevant." A student's voice taunted in a tone mockingly similar to hers. The students froze. It didn't stop there. Clip after clip rolled out. Voices mocking her accent, calling her names, planning the canvas stunt. One recording played the exact moment someone whispered, "Let's yank her shirt. I bet she cried." Then the laughter again, louder through the speakers than it had ever sounded in the room. The classroom went silent. But it wasn't just that room. The signal synced through the school's internal PA system, reached every hallway, every classroom, every office. Students in math paused mid-equation. Teachers in science dropped their markers. The principal looked up from her desk, stunned. The truth had risen, and it filled every space like thunderdot in the art room. Students stared at one another, the weight of their words rebounding back with raw clarity. A girl covered her mouth. A boy muttered, "Oh no." One student tried to leave, but froze at the door. They had expected humiliation, but not theirs, and still she stood, blouse torn, hands steady, face no longer shocked, just still, unapologetically still. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence had become the loudest sound in the building. One by one, the students lowered their eyes. The mockers sat down. The room, moments ago pulsing with chaos, now hummed with consequence. For the first time, they saw her not as a target, not as an outsider, but as a mirror, a human being. One they had tried to shatter, only to find their own reflections breaking. Instead, she took a breath, slow and deliberate. She walked over to her canvas, now torn and stained, and gently lifted it from the floor. She smoothed the corner, even though it wouldn't help. Then she stood upright again and looked out, not in anger, but in certainty. They had crossed a line, and she had drawn another one, clear, unshakable, and echoing through every speaker in that building. The first sound was subtle, just a low hum, a crackle of static that could have easily gone unnoticed. But in a school conditioned to the rhythm of bells and buzzers, any unexpected sound from the PA system drew attention like a pin drop in a cathedral. In classrooms across the building, students paused mid-sentence. Teachers halted mid, heads lifted, pens hovered over pages. The static settled into silence. Then, without warning, the silence cracked wide open. A voice rang out, "Not hers. Theirs." Sharp, mocking, unfiltered. The recording began with a burst of laughter, taunting, deliberate. Then came a voice, young and familiar. "What does she think she is? Some kind of artist." More laughter. Another voice layered on top, mimicking her tone in a thick, exaggerated drawl. "Today, class, we're gonna learn how to be irrelevant." The line was met with audible snorts and claps on the recording, a chorus of cruelty that once hid behind closed lips and knowing glances. Now, it was public. Raw, permanent. In classrooms, far from the art wing, confusion gave way to realization. Eyes darted around the room. Some students recognized the voices instantly. Others weren't sure who the speakers were, but the tone alone was enough to make their stomachs twist. Teachers stood frozen, listening in disbelief. The phrases were unmistakably cruel. There was no room for doubt, no chance to twist intent into something innocent. And the clips kept coming, like a tide that refused to recede. One recording followed. Another, some were brief but biting. She looks like she shops at a garage sale. Or watch this, I'm gonna make her spill her coffee again. Others went deeper, uglier. There were slurs whispered in dark corners, plans made under breathy laughter. One voice declared proudly, she won't last a semester. People like her never do. The school was wrapped in sound. From the science wing to the gymnasium, from the cafeteria to the front office. The recordings played on hall monitors stood slack-jawed near lockers. Secretaries exchanged horrified glances. The principal, who had just reached for her coffee, froze mid-motion. The mug never made it to her lips. She listened, eyes wide, heart sinking, and back in the art room, where it had all begun. The weight of every syllable came crashing down. The students who had once laughed with ease were now choking on silence. A boy gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned white. A girl covered her face with trembling hands. Another student reached for their phone, trying to mute the reality blaring around them, perhaps to check if this was some mistake, some prank, some hack in the system. But there was no error. There was only truth. They hadn't just been caught. They had been exposed. Each word, each laugh, each insult once dismissed as just jokes, just teasing, just harmless, for now echoed through the halls with the power of confession. There was no room left to lie, no place to hide. And the strange thing was, it wasn't the volume of the audio that struck them hard. It was the clarity, the unmistakable tone of their own voices, the confidence they had spoken with, the pleasure they had taken in her discomfort. They had forgotten that sound leaves traces, that words don't vanish when the target smiles and says nothing. They had forgotten that silence isn't always surrender. And she hadn't moved. She stood still near the front of the room, her blouse slightly torn, a button missing near the collar. Her fingers were relaxed. Her gaze was steady. She didn't look smug. She didn't look satisfied. She looked finished, as if the burden she'd carried alone had finally shifted onto the shoulders of those who had earned it. The recordings began to reach their crescendo snippets overlapping, weaving together into a tapestry of cruelty. The laughter at her canvas, the jokes about her clothes, the mimicry of her voice, and then, most damning of all, the plan to tear her down in front of everyone. At the critique, we grabbed the painting. Make a show out of it. Watch her crack. In that moment, the classroom's temperature seemed to drop. No one laughed. No one moved. Then, silence returned. The final clip faded away. The speakers went dead. But the stillness that followed was louder than anything they'd ever heard. That wasn't just embarrassment, it was reckoning. Some students turned their heads toward the windows, as if the light could save them. A few tried to meet her eyes, only to look away instantly, ashamed. One student, always the loudest, opened his mouth, but no words came out. He sat down, defeated. A girl who had shared memes mocking the teacher weeks earlier began quietly, crying, shoulders shaking. Another stared down at his own hands, like they didn't belong to him anymore. What stunned them most wasn't that she had caught them, it was that she had never once tried to stop them with anger. She had offered kindness, structure, patience, and they had mistaken all of it for fragility. Now they saw it for what it really was. Strength. The kind of strength that waits. The kind that collects. The kind that doesn't retaliate with fists, but with facts. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had just pressed a button, and in doing so, she had turned the entire school into witnesses. Outside the art room, rumors began spreading like sparks. Teachers rushed to check on her. Administrators made urgent calls to tech staff and guidance counselors. The principal stormed toward the wing, her heels clicking against the tile, unsure what to say when she arrived. But inside the art room, the teacher didn't move to meet anyone. She simply stood still, grounded, as if planted in the floor, as if she had finally become unmoved by the chaos around her. Even the canvas, ruined, smeared, cracked, stood propped gently against the wall. It looked different now, not just damaged, but dignified, a symbol of something survived. She took one small breath, the kind that clears fog, and let her shoulders fall into their natural rhythm again. Her voice hadn't spoken over the speakers, but her spirit had. In every echo, in every gasp, in every dawning face that now saw her not as a joke, not as a shadow, but as someone who had drawn the truth from silence. And as she stood there, blouse torn, truth spoken, no apology had yet been offered. She didn't need one, because for the first time, they had all heard what she had endured. The doors slammed open not long after the last clip faded. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp, authoritative. The principal appeared first, eyes wide, face flushed, clutching a walkie-talkie like a lifeline. Behind her were two security staff, stiff and uncertain, caught between protocol and disbelief. What they had just heard over the speakers couldn't be denied, couldn't be diluted. It wasn't rumor. It was evidence unfiltered, undeniable, and damning. She didn't speak when they entered. She didn't need to. The air in the room had already shifted. The students were still seated, stunned into silence. The ones responsible barely made eye contact. The others, those who had stayed silent in complicity, suddenly realized silence had never made them safe, just invisible. The teacher stood at the front, her blouse still slightly torn, but her posture perfect, a quiet monument in a shaken room. Her eyes met the principal's, but she said nothing. It was the silence of someone who no longer needed to explain herself. The principal looked around at the students, some visibly trembling, others hardened into a kind of fearful denial, and then gave a curt nod. "Everyone out," she said, voice shaking just enough to betray the chaos behind her words. Now the students rose slowly, dragging bags, keeping their eyes low. No one spoke. No one dared. The walk to the hallway felt like exile. A few snuck glances back at the teacher, but she didn't return them. She remained by her desk, hands still, breathing steady, and when the room finally emptied, she sat, not in defeat, in readiness. The fallout began within the hour. Phone calls were made to parents, to board members, to attorneys. What had started as whispers and cruelty had become a district-wide scandal. Meetings were scheduled on short notice, the kind with long tables, legal pads, and uncomfortable truths. Teachers were pulled into hush-hush staff meetings. Counselors were briefed. Damage control kicked into gear. But the footage spoke for itself. It painted a picture no one could unsee. The recordings had captured not just isolated incidents but a systemic rot. Mockery wasn't rare. It was constant, coordinated, a culture nurtured by winks and shrugs. Teachers and administrators had missed it or ignored it. Some had even chuckled when students imitated her outside class. The footage didn't just expose the students, it exposed the adults. It showed what happens when subtle racism hides behind teenage cruelty, and authority looks the other way. Suspensions came first, not just for the ones whose voices had been heard over the PIA, but for those who had encouraged, enabled, laughed, and recorded. Several students were placed on academic probation. Some were transferred. Others, facing expulsion, withdrew before the paperwork caught up with them. The parents, some furious, some humiliated, showed up in waves. Some demanded apologies from the teacher, believing somehow that her reaction had caused more harm than their children's actions. But most stared at the floor, avoiding the very same shame their children had inflicted so easily on her. The footage was reviewed again and again by district officials. With every viewing, the truth cut deeper. It wasn't just misconduct, it was moral failure. One counselor broke down while watching it. A veteran teacher requested early retirement, and the principal, she faced a formal investigation, not just for her oversight, but for the culture that had flourished on her watch. But through it all, the art teacher never asked for pity. She returned the next morning not with bravado, not with an entourage of lawyers or journalists, but alone, quiet, steady, as if nothing had changed and everything had. She wore the same brooch, the same long skirt. Her blouse was new crisp white cotton with soft pleats, but her expression hadn't changed. Still calm, still precise, like an artist preparing for her next piece, not her next battle. She entered the classroom before the bell. The walls were the same, but the silence that filled them now was different. It wasn't the silence of disrespect. It was reverence. Or, perhaps, reckoning. She moved to the front, removed a fresh canvas from the cabinet, and placed it on the easel. The morning sun spilled in through the blinds, cutting through dust motes like brushstrokes of light. She picked up a palette, laid out colors, took a breath, and dipped her brush in red dot. One bold stroke, from top to bottom, clean, intentional. It sliced through the white space with fire. That red it wasn't anger, it wasn't blood, it was power, unapologetic, alive. The beginning of something new. Students entered quietly. Most were not the same. Those who had caused harm were gone, or assigned elsewhere. The few who had stayed now walked differently, shoulders lower, steps quieter. There were new faces too, transfers from other schools. Curious but cautious, sensing the gravity of the room, they took their seats slowly. No one spoke, no one dared joke. The teacher didn't greet them with fanfare. She simply looked up, met each pair of eyes, and nodded once. Then she handed out brushes. Some students hesitated, unsure if they were worthy to pick up a tool of creation. In the same space they had helped tarnish, but she didn't rush them. She offered no lectures, no warnings. Just brushes, clay, canvas, dot, and silence. Until one girl, her voice barely above a whisper, asked, "Can I help you mix the blue?" The teacher nodded. The spell was broken. Slowly, the others began to move. Palettes filled with color. Water cups were passed around. The faint sound of pencils scratching returned. There was no laughter, not yet. But there was effort, concentration, the beginnings of restoration, and still, she painted. Stroke after stroke. The canvas took shape, slowly, not a figure, not a landscape, but something abstract. Bold colors layered like stories, red, gold, black, violet. Each hue seemed to carry a meaning only she understood, a declaration in color. They watched her in awe not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. She had walked back into the same room that once tried to break her and turned it into her studio, her sanctuary. In the hallway, a few students from other classes paused at the door, peeking in through the glass. They didn't see the same woman they once mocked. They saw a master at work. And within the school itself, changes began. New policies were drafted around student conduct. Cultural sensitivity training became mandatory. A task force was formed led by teachers who had once stayed silent, now determined to do better. The principal, still under review, no longer walked with the same unchecked authority. Her eyes lowered in the teacher's presence now. Meetings included her. This time, not as a subject of gossip, but as a respected voice, yet she never bragged. She never once brought up the footage again. It had spoken for her, and now, she let her art do the rest. By the end of the week, her new painting stood tall, near the classroom window. The students had watched it form, day by day, stroke by stroke, but it wasn't until it was complete that they truly understood what it meant. It wasn't a scene of revenge, it was a portrait of resilience. Months drifted by, like the soft strokes of watercolor bleeding across a page. The seasons turned, and, with them, the school transformed it with announcements or banners, but with something deeper, quieter. It began in the art room. The space that had once echoed with mockery now breathed with intention. Students arrived on time. They cleaned their palettes without being told. They spoke less, observed more. There was a stillness to their presence, a reverence that didn't need rules. Something about that room felt sacred now. The old posters remained. The sunlight still caught on the shelves of dried paint, but the energy, that had changed entirely. It wasn't a revolution anyone wrote about in newspapers. It didn't trend, but it was real. Change arrived like a hush after thunder. The brushstrokes that had once been rushed or careless were now precise, thoughtful, deliberate. Some students who had never taken art seriously before began staying after class. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They lingered at their canvases, not for grades, but for something personal. Their work became vulnerable, raw, honest. Pieces no longer imitated TikTok trends or copied from Pinterest boards. They reflected pain, hope, identity. They reflected them, and the teacher who made that possible. She never lectured about the past. She never reminded anyone of what they did, what they said. She didn't need to. Her silence was not was grace. She carried herself the same way she always had, with quiet strength, gentle dignity, and sharp focus. Each day, she opened the doors with the same rhythm. She arranged the brushes, swept the floor, watered the class plants. But the room was never the same after her. New policies emerged in the school quietly but firmly. Faculty meetings shifted. Professional development now included mandatory bias training. New teachers were mentored with empathy in mind. The leadership team began listening more. Not because someone forced them, but because they'd been forced to listen once when it mattered most. That moment, the one where cruel voices were blasted over the loudspeakers, became a reference point. It lived in the walls like a warning. No plaque commemorated it, but everyone remembered. The body cam incident, once whispered behind cupped hands, evolved into legend. Students from other grades heard about it secondhand. Some exaggerated it, others softened it, but none ignored it. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice and how it arrived, not in fury, but in clarity. It became a lesson passed between lockers, whispered on buses, tucked between laughs during lunch. Don't underestimate the quiet ones, especially the ones who watch, especially the ones who prepare. When the woman finally announced her departure, there was no dramatic send-off. No assemblies, no grand speeches. Just a letter posted quietly in the staff room. She was moving to another district somewhere closer to family, where she could lead a new community center's arts initiative. She thanked the school for its time, its growth, its future. But between the lines, everyone knew what the truth was. She wasn't leaving because she was tired. She was leaving because her work here was done. The final day she taught, the students gathered without being told. No gifts, no glittered posters. Just a table filled with their artwork pieces they had painted, sculpted, drawn, written. That reflected everything she had taught them without ever raising her voice. One student, usually quiet and forgettable in the crowd, stepped forward. He held out a clay figure. It was rough, unpolished, imperfect, but it was a mirror of her poised, tall, arms folded, eyes lifted. She took it with a small smile and nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't say goodbye. She simply said, "Keep telling the truth with your work, even when no one's listening." And then she left, but the truth didn't leave with her. Weeks turned to months, and her presence remained like a soft fingerprint on everything she touched. A substitute filled her position, respectful and eager, but she knew those shoes couldn't be filled. Instead, she honored the space, kept it warm, continued the rituals, preserved the atmosphere. Students who once feared the art room now chose it as a refuge. It became the one place in the school where students could cry without ridicule, express themselves without interruption, explore without judgment. Art club memberships soared. Local competitions now featured submissions from their school that radiated authenticity. Other teachers, once passive in the face of cruelty, began speaking up more. They pulled students aside, not to scold but to ask, "Are you okay?" They walked hallways with more awareness, eye contact, compassion. The culture of complicity began to crack, and that loudspeaker, every time it buzzed, every time static hummed before an announcement, students paused just for a second. It wasn't fear, it was memory. An echo of the day truth had taken over the airwaves. A day when authority didn't come from a badge or a title, but from a woman who dared to let evidence speak, louder than her voice. It was never about revenge for her. She hadn't needed punishment. She hadn't demanded apologies. She had simply gathered facts, packaged them in dignity, and let the world decide what to do with them. Her justice didn't come with violence. It came with clarity, and that's what stayed. Some of the students who had once laughed at her changed it slowly, subtly. One started a mural project on empathy. Another joined student council and introduced peer accountability policies. A few wrote essays about what respect meant and submitted them to national competitions. Not everyone changed, but enough did. Her story didn't end in that school, it spread. Teachers from neighboring districts reached out, curious about her methods. Administrators asked how she stayed calm under pressure. Parents told their children the story like a parable. Her body cam had done more than reveal injustice. It had revealed possibility, the idea that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply records, waits, exposes. But perhaps the most enduring part of her legacy wasn't the scandal, or the footage, or even the policy changes. It was the invisible shift she inspired, the one that made students look at each other differently. The one that made teachers ask themselves, what am I overlooking? The one that reminded every person walking those halls that silence doesn't protect truth, it delays it. In time, new students arrived who never met her. To them, the stories sounded mythical. A teacher with a camera in her brooch, names broadcasted over speakers. It felt cinematic. But those who had been there knew better. They didn't speak of her with awe. They spoke of her with respect. She was the teacher who didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten, didn't flinch. She just told the truth and made sure the world couldn't look away. And so, every time the PA system buzzed, every time someone reached for a brush or opened a sketchbook, her presence flickered in the background, not as a shadow, but as a light. Her art lived on. In them, around them, beyond them, and her legacy. It never needed a signature. It signed itself into their memory forever.